Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 291. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent Jiu-Jitsu approach. Today, I'm here with longtime friend of the show, Mr. Ben Van Doren. Ben, how's it going, sir?
It's going great, Steve. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here and navigate this topic with you today.
I'm excited to have you as well. Now, you and I just met for the first time in person a few weeks ago. We had a camp in Lansing, Michigan at Magic BJJ, but your gym is very close by in Michigan. And so we got to meet up in person after talking online for years and years and years. It was great to finally meet you human to human. For those who don't know you, though, why don't you give yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, my name is Ben Van Doren. I am a head coach and co-owner of a gym called Deep Blue Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm a black belt under Lucas Lepri. And in the context of a conversation we're going to have today, as far as my professional life outside of Jiu-Jitsu, I was a restaurant operator for over 20 years. So I have lots of experience managing people, managing culture, having difficult conversations with people. And that's something that I think is really important in our Jiu-Jitsu community as far as being able to... The conversation of culture is big. There's lots of different topics involved. So I think in this, the topic of tough conversations is one of the most important factors to building and maintaining and protecting good culture. So my professional background is really where that experience comes from. So that's what I'm hoping to share today. Obviously, I'm a longtime fan of the show, big fan of the Discord community and everything that you're putting together. So I am glad to have the opportunity to try to contribute to that and give back a little bit.
Oh, thanks, buddy. I truly appreciate that. Tell me a little bit about the gym here, Deep Blue, because this is going to probably lead into what we talk about here today. As you mentioned, the goal here is to talk about difficult coaching conversations, but all of that comes down to the culture that you set in the gym. What's your gym like, and what are kind of your goals in terms of what you're creating there at Deep Blue?
Yeah, so my gym, I have a relatively small gym as far as membership. We're about 3 years old, so we're still growing. We have a decent-sized kids program. When I opened the gym, my philosophy towards Jiu-Jitsu has always been it's something that can benefit anybody. But in order for that to happen, you have to run a gym and run a culture that everyone can walk into the place and feel welcome and feel like they can engage. And I've done that really with a team of people. I have a business owner. I have a group of coaches that I've known for a long time prior to opening the gym. And in my view, we opened this gym and sort of done that together. The sort of core group of people really all understand the cultural mission, and every day I feel like they live it, which is important. Our mission is really just to make Jiu-Jitsu approachable. We have different classes to kind of give people some options as they come in, depending on their comfort level. And if anyone's in the area, please stop in. We have an open door policy. We promote cross training. Everyone is welcome in our space. So if you're in the Southwest Michigan area, come check us out. Awesome.
Well, I will put a link to all of your stuff in the show notes and we can get into that deeper. But first, let's talk about culture then. Again, as the reason I thought you would be an amazing guest for this conversation is because people who have met you probably have an understanding that you've got a really level head, you're calm under pressure, but you're also able and willing to have some of those difficult conversations and to have them professionally. And I think this is a skill set that a lot of coaches don't have. And honestly, I can kind of understand how that could come to be. A lot of people get into running a gym, not because they're necessarily super passionate about being a jiu-jitsu business owner, but rather because they just love jiu-jitsu and they wanted to find a way to make a career out of it so they could pay the bills and keep doing jiu-jitsu. And I think what happens a lot of the time is people come into this idea of gym ownership with a lot of technical skill, but they don't necessarily have business skill or social skill or emotional intelligence. And, you hear these horror stories of things that happen at the gym and you think, how could that possibly happen? And I think a lot of the time it's just that the coach didn't expect and didn't think about the fact that they would have to have those conversations. They didn't have the tools to do it. And so they kind of ignored the problem or avoided it in the hopes that it would just go away on its own. And a lot of the time, as we know, that's not what happens. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you to maybe talk a little bit about setting culture and how difficult conversations fit into that culture and how the coach's role kind of fits in as well.
Yeah, well, I think that was a perfect introduction to the problem. Jiu-Jitsu has a very, very strong social gravity that pulls people together and creates very strong bonds. So when you see things in Jiu-Jitsu where people feel like they have to leave an environment, there's gym drama, there's gym splits, all these things are happening. It's happening on the backdrop of an environment that naturally brings people together. So something has to be pretty significant to pull it apart. And to your point about it being a skill, I think that's where it lies, is that we grow up, we turn into adults, and we don't realize that I guess we sort of take for granted that we know how to deal with people, when in reality we don't, at least when we get into new types of relationships, which is one of the things I wanted to talk about today. So I think that to understand and be able to approach tough conversations, I think it's important to start with sort of a conceptual framework for how to think about them. And a lot of this starts to tie into how do you define your culture? How do you manage it? How do you build it? In terms of a framework, I think it's important that you start with understanding that any conversation that you have is going to happen within the context of a relationship that exists. And we grow up in natural relationships. When I use the word natural, meaning they feel natural to us, they're sort of naturally occurring relationships with our immediate family, our siblings. If you grow up in a community, you may grow up with friends, and all these relationships just feel natural to you, and you know how to navigate them and you have experience in them. And then you turn into an adult and you start getting into new types of relationships that are defined differently. The characteristic of them is different. Sometimes those relationships may be impermanent. The goals of the relationships are different, and the context in which they exist is different. So for example, you could be very, very close with someone at work, but your relationship is sort of defined as colleagues, or you can be very, very close with your training partners in the gym, but your relationship is just sort of defined within the context of that gym experience. And if you don't stop and rethink those relationships and how they're defined differently and what the boundaries of the relationship are, then you're not going to be equipped to have tough conversations within those relationships in terms of understanding what are the boundaries, what are the goals, is this relationship going to end, is it going to change? And so I think that starting there and understanding that is important. So your relationship with your best friend you grew up with and the relationship with your training partner may both be great, but they're different, and they're going to go in different paths and have different types of experiences. I use the word for newer relationships unnatural. Not those relationships are bad, but they just don't feel as natural to us as we try to navigate them. And this is where people get into situations and they have to address something, have a conversation, and they don't know how, because it's an unnatural relationship where they haven't navigated these things yet, and they have to figure out how to do it. And that's where I think hesitation comes from. So when we're looking at these unnatural relationships, our goal would be to make them natural, right? Any relationship we have, we want to be positive. We want to build it. We want to make it so that we can feel good navigating ourselves within the context of that relationship. But we have to do that deliberately. We can't just do that, with no strategy, no plan, just let things happen on accident. And if we do it deliberately, we can sort of take ownership over those unnatural relationships and turn them natural in a way that's healthy and productive. And obviously in a gym environment, that would be our goal with our training partners, with our coaches. If you are a coach with your students, you want that to happen as much as possible. Within that conversation about relationships, there's obviously a topic about, boundaries and red lines. If you have challenging, tough talks in a relationship, at some point you may have to make a decision that relationship has to change, whether it ends or just the dynamics of it change. And how you draw red lines, where you draw them, I think it's very much part of the conversation that we're going to have today about when is it acceptable to stay in a relationship and could keep working through it, and how do you do that, and when do you just draw the line and walk away from it, whether that means you're a gym owner and the student is no longer welcome in your environment, or you're a student and you no longer want to participate on a team where you don't feel comfortable because of something that's happened. So it's important to draw those red lines and stick to them just for the sake of your own health, your own integrity. So that's, I think, concept one that's really important, is that there's different types of relationships. We have to be conscious of that. We have to put thought into defining them and understanding that these new relationships we can navigate differently than these sort of natural relationships that we grew up with. I think a second important topic when trying to frame conversations and how we address them is conversation isn't conflict. And that's a perception switch that I think is very hard for people. And sometimes it doesn't happen until they get experience doing it. And a lot of hesitation that I think people have when something's happened and they feel like they need to go address it, start a conversation, is they feel like this conversation may turn into conflict, and they're hesitant about that. And so conversations can be conflict if people are screaming at each other, but that's outside of the framework of what we want. That's not our goal. We want to navigate this much better than that. So if you're in that type of conversation, as we say in Jiu-Jitsu, like, you messed up a long time ago at that point in terms of how we address the relationship and how we address our communication with each other. And so if you can start there, the conversations are happening within the context of this relationship. You can start thinking about it in a way, have confidence that you're going to navigate through the conversation without turmoil in terms of the relationship or the actual existence of the conversation. I think a third very important concept and sort of framing how we're going to approach conversations is understanding, and you mentioned this in sort of your introduction to the topic, is that having tough conversations with people, addressing things, it's a skill that has to be developed over time. So if you've never been in a position where you have to do it, then it's normal for you to feel unprepared, feel like it's going to be awkward, to be intimidated by it. The only way to get good at that, though, is to engage in it. And there's ways to practice before you engage, but you have to engage to develop this as a skill in order to navigate things properly. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. And also, the more you do it, the more you can start to effectively turn those unnatural relationships into natural ones that are healthy and productive, just by having good conversations and addressing things properly as they come up. And the last sort of piece to the framework that I want to sort of use in talking about this is that when we're talking about relationships and having tough conversations, we're really talking about changing the way someone interacts with you, changing the way someone behaves, changing someone's commitment level to something depending on the context. And so if you're asking someone to make a change, we do have to have some grace and understanding, like, change takes time. And if there's a very serious sort of red line issue, then there's no wiggle room. Like, you cross the line and then, the relationship's going to end. You're no longer welcome in my gym, for example. But there's things that aren't red line issues that may take multiple conversations. And you have to understand that so that you're prepared for that, and kind of have a strategy going in with how you're going to approach the first conversation. And if I have to have a second or a third or a fourth, how am I going to navigate myself through multiple conversations and start to define them differently and get myself set up for the next one?
A lot of great points there. And it's interesting you bring this up, because in the jiu-jitsu space, we all know that to get good at something, you need to do it a lot. You'll hear competitors talk about this all the time, and about how the best way to become a good competitor is just to compete a lot. But yet when it comes to difficult conversations in the gym, coaches will often be very avoidant around that. And I've had interesting conversations with really well-known competitors who will describe themselves as being conflict avoidant. And I always think, man, that's interesting. You're willing to go out there in front of a crowd of thousands of people or more and have a jiu-jitsu match, but you're not comfortable having a difficult conversation. I think that goes to show how hard it can be for people to have these kinds of discussions sometimes. The old nugget of wisdom is that one of the greatest fears that many people have is public speaking. And I think that this is kind of related to that. Sometimes trying to connect with people on an emotional level and sort out your problems can be harder than even resolving things physically. It's a very hard skill set. And I think a lot of gym owners just aren't equipped for that. As you mentioned, there are scales and gradients of problems. If you are a gym owner, you are going to have to deal with all sorts of difficult conversations, some of them at the level of the absurd, just dumb things that you can't believe you even need to address, but other things that are so severe, as you mentioned, that you can't even take the time to address them through conversation. You need to take action immediately. And I think one of the things that we see often, especially looking at fight sports as an example and the situation surrounding them, is failing to read when someone has crossed over that red line, giving people maybe a bit of slack when you absolutely should not do that, or conversely, thinking a problem is too small and not really being able to deal with it or being willing to deal with it. And that kind of lets it fester and grow into something bigger than it ever should have.
Yeah, and there's a lot to what you just said. I think there's a lot of art in what you said. It's not just science as far as like we're going to define these specific things and deal with them a specific way. I think a lot of it is navigating people, navigating personalities, navigating their relationships. The competition example, you go to compete, but that's not your first repetition. You spend a lot of time on the mats practicing for this. If you go to have your first tough conversation and you haven't practiced that at all, then you're not going to get very good results. So you could sort of practice this stuff ahead of time so that when you're going into these tough conversations, you sort of rehearse them. You've kind of gone through the motions. In my professional life, that's something that we would do is in terms of trying to develop my managers that work for me to develop the skill is I would like role play with them and do everything I could to throw them off and make them sort of surprise them in the moment, make the conversation go sideways, make it go well, and sort of force them to deal with that stuff. And so there's ways to practice this. And that's important. If you know that there's something that has to be addressed and you're not preparing for it, then it's going to severely impact your ability to do it productively. When we have conversations, I like to category conversations into two sort of broad categories. And one is conversations that you need to have immediately. Like in the moment, you have to have it. You can't wait. These conversations, for many people, I think it's the hardest because you can't plan and you can't practice. And I think this is the scenario that we hear from in the Jiu-Jitsu community from students. Like they're on the mat and they're rolling with somebody and they're not comfortable, or they're on the mat and someone says something that they think is out of line, and they have to figure out how to address that in the moment. So these immediate type conversations are difficult because of they're unplanned and the sort of the inability to think about them and reflect before going into the conversation. So one thing about that is really important is when something happens, we have to very clearly identify what the problem is, and whatever we communicate, we can only communicate the problem itself, sort of like what's the focal point, and give very clear direction about what's the issue. So, if you're rolling with someone as an example and they're being super aggressive and you don't feel safe, you can stop the roll and you can say that. But what about what is happening makes you feel that way? Are they moving too quick? Are they grabbing you too hard? Are they pulling on submissions too quickly? So identifying exactly what the issue is and sort of addressing it head on is without any, addressing it objectively with positive assumptions about how the person's going to receive it is how you're going to have to do that in the moment. And then when something happens, we have to take it from there as far as if they respond well to you or don't respond well to you. Right? Sometimes conversations that happen in the moment, the agenda sometimes has to be just about managing the moment and not managing the conversation. So for example, if you just have to stop something from happening, remove someone from a situation, and then follow up later with the actual conversation, what you deal with in the moment is just stopping the moment that's happening that's detrimental to you or your teammates or your culture or your community. And what that does is it allows you to take an immediate conversation and turn it into a conversation that you can plan for just because you managed the moment correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And, it's interesting that you bring this up because, again, drawing the parallel back to competition, everyone who competes knows that you have to plan for competition, and people have ways to do that. In fact, the preparation for a competition is often the hardest and most challenging part. And what you're touching on here is that for difficult conversations, there's also a way to prepare for those and to develop that skill set in a simulated environment. I'd love to maybe explore that because I think you're right. The best time to prepare for a conversation is before you need to have it. And some types of difficult conversations need immediate remediation. The example that comes to my mind is two of your people are sparring and they're being unsafe. You can't afford to wait until you get someone alone to talk to them at that point. You have to intervene before an injury happens. And that can put the coach in a difficult position because they have to do something very challenging that they had not prepared for and they did not expect they would have to do. So I'd love to pick your brain about this. I mean, how do you train people to have difficult conversations and get them comfortable doing that? And then how do you help people identify what the strategy should be when it's time to have one of those conversations? You talked about how some difficult conversations need to happen right away. Some of them can maybe be deferred until you get a private moment. So in addition to how you train people, I'd also love to know, how do you help people identify when to intervene, whether it needs to be now or whether it can be done later?
Yeah, I think that as far as the when component of that question, there's so many examples we could parse through. What you have to make an assessment about is what is happening right now have to be stopped because it's detrimental. And some of that is context. So for example, if someone is standing right in front of you doing something that's inappropriate, obviously you deal with it in the moment. But let's say something happens on the mat that's inappropriate, someone's being too aggressive, says something that's inappropriate, but you don't see it and you go home and a student calls you, you have to address it before the next time that person comes into the gym. But that doesn't have to be like right this second, right? It just has to be before the next time it comes into the gym to make sure that it gets addressed. And so the immediacy, I think, is the relevance of the moment that's happening and the impact that is happening in front of you. And I think this is a skill as well, as far as assessing things. So for me, I've gotten to be able to define my parameters about what that looks like pretty tightly because of my experience and cultures doing it, and having lots of experience seeing people come in, behave a certain way, kind of push the boundaries a little bit, and seeing where that leads if you don't nip it in the butt right away and be very clear. And so there's an art form to that in the context that what my standards are and what yours are in terms of how you want, the culture of your gym to look versus mine. It's difficult to lay out something that everyone can use. I think it's important to give people sort of like the power and autonomy to say that you can speak up, right? Like if you're a student of mine and you see something, like not only can you, but I expect you to take on that responsibility. And if you don't feel comfortable doing it yourself, I expect you to come to me to tell me that you observed something so that I can go follow up with it after the fact and deal with it. And that was, my professional life, that would happen quite a bit. As I'm developing managers, they would know how to deal with something, but if something came up and they weren't sure what decision I would make, or they just needed to separate two people, they might just say, hey, you need to go home and you're going to come back on Thursday and you need to talk to Ben and he's going to navigate this issue with you, right? Just to manage the moment, give time to set everything up for a longer conversation, give time to think about it. As far as training people, I think you have to, address this issue. If you just sort of ignore it, no one's going to practice anything. And I think this kind of goes back to the point about just relationships that you have and being in your relationships and the bonding that happens in Jiu-Jitsu. You go to the gym, you love Jiu-Jitsu, you think it's amazing, you're passionate about it. You take that and you project that passion onto the people that you train with, and you just think everything's great. And then all of a sudden something happens and it just seems so out of place and you don't know how to deal with it because of all the positive feelings you've had up until then. So you have to know ahead of time that even though this is a great place and we're all engaging in something that we love and supporting each other, at the end of the day, we have to protect each other, protect the culture, protect the gym, and be able to speak up when it matters. And you have to say that up front to people to sort of empower them to do that. And if they don't do that in the moment, then that just gives you an opportunity to empower people after the fact. Say, okay, next time this happens, I need you to either say X, Y, and Z in the moment to stop it, or you need to come to me to let me know, be my second pair of eyes and ears, and I'll go follow up with it. And the more you do that in a culture and environment, the more people kind of get comfortable with it. And this is why I think that this is a conversation about conversations, but a conversation about culture, because people have to know what to look for, and that's going to be defined by your culture. People have to know when there's red flags, when there's red lines that are crossed. People have to feel comfortable coming to you to bring things to your attention and have confidence that you're going to address them properly. So all that is part of the broader cultural conversation and part of the conversation about building good relationships with people through these types of conversations. Some specifics about training people to have the tough conversation is, one, I think it's really, really important to teach people how to listen. Having a tough conversation is more about listening than talking. And I can kind of navigate through what that would look like in a moment. And one thing that you'll find through experience and having difficult conversations is that your impression of something halfway through a conversation is almost always different than it was when you started the conversation. And if you just know that, then you're going to go into the conversation differently. Does that make sense? If you go into the conversation with all these preconceived notions and you're just sort of dumping on somebody, then you're really not from the get-go having a great conversation and not really trying to learn about what's happening and why people perceive the thing that happened correctly. When we're doing that, we're really engaging in what I call long form sorts of discussions with somebody. We're past the point of immediately dealing with something, and we have the time to plan things out, whether it's you're doing it yourself or you're working with someone to do it. So from a training standpoint, as an example, one thing that I used to do is if a tough conversation had to be had, I would make one of my managers do it, and I would just sit there and take notes and have the conversation. And then post-conversation, I could give them feedback about how it should have been navigated, help them set up for it better. So those are some examples of things that people can do to practice. When we're looking at addressing these sort of more long-form type conversations, I think it's really important that you prepare for the conversation before you start and get as much information as you possibly can. So let's say, for example, someone comes to you, you're a coach, a student comes to you and says, hey, yesterday in class, I'm going to come up with a theoretical name. John was just being really, really hard on a new student. You were just saying things to him. He just seemed like he's upset. And I'm kind of worried that John overstepped his boundaries and was being disrespectful to this new student. So with that scenario, coach could just get mad at John and be like, hey man, why are you running off new students and being a jerk? What's your problem? What's going on? But if we stopped first and kind of try to get everyone's perspective, we have to address John to figure out what happened, but we want to address everyone else in the room first, touching base with people hey, yesterday you were in class. Did you see this exchange between John and this new student? If your name is John out there, I'm not talking about you. This is theoretical. But we have to get as much information information we can to get as much perception as we can. And then when we have the conversation with John and we're preparing for it, our goal should be to get John's perspective in the context of doing all the homework that we need to understand what happened. And we need to do that at the beginning of the conversation. So we're walking in with the perspective of everybody else, prepared to sit down and get their perspective before we do anything as far as us communicating, or me, in this case, say, communicating as a coach to John what they should have been doing in that context. Because things can change. Like maybe John was being a jerk, but maybe John was actually doing something good, and you don't know that yet because of the scenario that has changed. Going into the conversation, and this is this sort of theoretical event that has happened, maybe I'm, me or a coach is frustrated with this John because of the way they treated a new student, but we gather information. I always recommend that if you're going to plan a conversation that is going to be challenging, that you let them know ahead of time, like, hey, I need to sit down and talk to you about something, just so you're not catching them off guard. I think that's a mistake because people will naturally get defensive and you don't really give them time to mentally prepare for a tough conversation. I also suggest that people write down the first couple sentences of a tough conversation. It's really important that going into something, you define the tone and the topic really, really clearly about how this is going to happen, and don't make it about anything else, and continue to steer it back to the tone and topic in the conversation. So if you're the person preparing for that, these are the things that you need to do. And if you are trying to teach somebody how to have difficult conversations, this is what you need to be prompting that person to do, to walk through the steps of all the pre-talk things that you need to do to get ready. When you have the conversation, I always start a conversation with just trying to listen. Obviously, we have to kind of throw the topic on the table, but doing it with as little sort of commentary as possible about how you feel, about what anyone else saw. Just, I heard this occurrence happen. I heard that you were training with someone the other day, or and someone just sort of perceived that you were being kind of hard on them, and I just want to get some idea of what happened, or do you remember what happened that day? And then in that scenario, topic is on the table, I'm trying to establish a tone on the table where I'm just sort of searching for facts. And then that's when you listen and let John say everything that he had to say. Now, if John says, you know what, I was just having a crappy day and I was just being a jerk, then the conversation goes in one direction, right? About how, John needs to respect people on the mats. But maybe John says, you know what, I was rolling with someone else and this new student came in and they were just rolling really, really aggressively with someone. And that person told them to slow down and they didn't. So I had to intervene, and I told him to slow down and told him that wasn't going to be acceptable here if he wasn't going to pay attention to his training partners. So if that's the response that John gives me, all of a sudden the entire conversation changes, because John actually did something that I would want him to do. Again, this is a theoretical John. And even if he did it in a way that needs to be corrected, he's still acting in good faith. He's still acting to protect the culture, protect his teammates. And I would have never gotten that from him if I just sat down and just kind of blasted him with my frustration that he was being disrespectful to the team. So that listening component is really important. Does that make sense?
100% it makes sense. Very much aligns with my experience as well. As you mentioned, there are times when you have to take immediate action right now, usually if there is an imminent safety risk to someone in the room. But those situations aside, usually, if you can defer a conversation to give yourself time to plan and to give yourself time to get more info, it's almost always a better thing at the end of the day. This is a lesson that I learned at the workplace and I've deployed kind of everywhere in my life. You have to avoid the instinctive reaction sometimes to just talk right away and just confront someone right away when there's a problem. Because first of all, you don't necessarily have all of the information to be doing that. Second, it might not be the correct forum to do that, because again, depending on the nature of the issue, it may be in your best interests to have this conversation privately. And in fact, often if you have to have a very difficult, critical conversation, if I can afford to do it privately rather than stop and confront them right now, I would prefer to do that. Again, with the caveat that some things you just need to deal with them right on the spot. Usually things relating to safety, you can't afford to defer them. But the other thing too is if you give yourself time to prepare, then you're not forced into this reactive mode where you might be doing things out of emotion, or you might be saying things that you haven't had time to think about. Also, sometimes if you're put on the spot where you have to answer right away, you might feel forced to provide an answer that isn't really that well baked. And so one of the lessons I've always learned is when someone puts me into a situation like this, if I can buy myself a bit of time to organize and compose and get more information, I definitely want to do that. And you're very right too about understanding whether the other person is acting in good faith or not. Sometimes a person can do the wrong thing, but they had the best of intentions. And the way that you deal with that has to be very different from if someone was acting in bad faith. At the end of the day, we as coaches are here to teach people to be better. And if you come down on them with a level of punishment that wasn't really fair, considering they may have been acting in good faith, you run the risk of not just hurting the relationship and undermining yourself as a coach, but you also run the risk of damaging the culture as well, because you could create an environment where people are afraid to speak up and come to you with legitimate problems. So again, you have to understand that when you are dealing with a difficult situation, it's not just about resolving that situation right here, right now, but it's also about setting the tone for the room so everyone understands how you will deal with difficult situations in the future as well. And you never want to come across as a person who is so aggressive or angry or unhinged or unfair that people are afraid to expose issues to you and bring these things to light. That's the worst thing that can happen if you want to build a good culture.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect explanation to where the connect the conversation and culture piece, like why it's so important. And tough conversations are often your very strong relationships. A lot of times you're strong because you've gone through something together, right? Like a relationship that could be new, you deal with something together and you do that successfully, you move on, that relationship is most likely going to grow. So one thing about conversations that are more challenging is oftentimes they involve relationships that have been around longer, that may have started to feel like natural relationships. And I think that's because when someone's been around a while, they tend to have adopted whatever culture you're in. So if a new student comes in and they don't really understand the culture yet, they're more likely to do something that has to be addressed versus someone who's been around a long time and understands sort of the norms in the environment. And so, these conversations are going to be happening with people that you've known for a long time. And sometimes that means the relationship changes. Sometimes that means the relationship ends. And I think that's why it's important that you're able to sort of define the nature of those relationships that you have with people in general, in terms of your culture, and also as you start to approach the conversation. You should always have in your mind, like you're assuming the positive in somebody, but if you're going to strategize and plan conversation, you also have to sort of know, like, I'm going to go into this thinking that this conversation is going to go well, but if it starts to not go well, like where is the red line that I'm going to draw where something's going to change? Like conversation's done and I'm going to have to depart from this relationship. And you have to think about that ahead of time so that you're prepared to navigate the conversation in that direction if necessary.
Yeah, great advice, great advice. Now, where do you stand on the old conventional wisdom that you should praise in public and criticize in private? I've always preferred to take this approach if I can. And if you hear stories of people explaining their bad experiences on Reddit with their coach, a lot of the time, it seems like their main grievance was not necessarily that their coach was unfair or unreasonable, but it's often that their coach chewed them out in public in front of the class. And the experience that a person goes through when they receive that kind of criticism and feedback is very different if they get it in a one-on-one situation versus if it's just blasted out and everyone overhears. What are your thoughts on when you should talk to someone one-on-one in private versus when it's a conversation that needs to be had with the group?
I think it's almost always should be one-on-one. I do think there are some minor exceptions, although not many. When you're dealing with an issue, and this goes kind of back to what you said before about sending the message that you're going to deal with problems in the gym. Your people need to know that a problem's been dealt with. That doesn't mean you do it publicly. You can deal with the problem privately with the person that you need to address. But if student X comes to you about student Y and you privately address student Y, student X still needs to know that you address student Y. They need to know that you address the problem. So that's not publicly in the sense that you're going to address it in front of a bunch of people, but it's not so private that you can't do follow-up. Like, people need to know that this has happened. The only exception I would say to situations where that you should do something publicly is if someone does something, is these sort of immediate concerns. Like if someone does something that's sort of egregious and you need to let them know like right then, now, and also in front of other people, that's not acceptable. So if someone says something that was like sexist on the mat, I'm going to call them out on the mat. Now, that person probably is going to feel embarrassed. Maybe they feel bad. I'll have a follow-up conversation with them so that they understand like what is acceptable and why I called them out. But your team needs to know that you stopped that in the moment. Even if you waited till after class and pulled them off and had that conversation, your team is going to be like, you're starting to sort of erode the norm. Like we can just say that stuff in here now. It's okay. I think, and this is only like the most extreme examples. Usually I think it needs to be in private, but there are some exceptions where I think that you have to let everyone know that it's being addressed.
Yeah, I would say that the other situation that comes to mind for me is when there's an imminent safety threat. So thoughts coming to mind would be you see two people rolling and one of them is clearly being unsafe. Often this is going to happen at the less experienced belt levels where someone is doing moves that are, or doing things with an intensity where an injury seems very, very likely. In that situation, you don't want to wait until after class to corner the person one-on-one and tell them about it. You need to intervene right now before someone gets injured. And similarly, the other situation, which is basically another look at the same problem, is when two people are rolling and it's escalated to the point where it's not a friendly roll anymore. So if you see two people in the room and they're rolling and they've kind of gotten out of control and very clearly this is turning into an actual fight, you probably want to intervene at that point. But yeah, I also like the point that you brought up about when someone says something that is just completely out of line. That's an interesting one because there might be some people who would say, well, you know, if Bob made a really sexist joke, I don't want to embarrass him in front of the group, so I'll talk to him one-on-one after. But in a case like that, where what was said was such an attack on the culture, I totally get your perspective that we got to deal with this right now so that everyone can see that it's being dealt with right now. As Leif Babin has said, culture isn't what you preach, it's what you tolerate. And if people get the impression that you're tolerating this stuff, even if you actually did go and deal with it in private, but if people didn't see that, if they get the impression that you've just let this slide, then now you've let the culture move and there's more stuff that's being allowed into that culture that you probably don't want to be allowed. So I think it makes sense in a situation like that to shut things down right away. And I mean, if someone gets offended by that or upset about that, that sucks for them. But again, some things like sexism and bigotry and stuff just shouldn't have a place in a gym with a good culture.
Yeah, and that just goes to red lines. Like, what are your red lines? I mean, those are sort of extreme examples that everyone should agree on. There may be some other examples that may be different from gym to gym. And, you know, for example, you know, I try to run a very family-friendly gym. So in some gyms, maybe guys come in, they talk about how they got drunk last night and who they slept with, and that's okay. In my gym, I don't want that, right? So, you know, I lead by example as far as the things I talk about in my gym, and that's the culture. And that might be an issue where like one gym to the next, things might change. I do think as far as like the public, calling people out publicly, I think you can call out issues publicly, but not personally. So for example, if people are rolling aggressively, you know, you could circle people up or kind of stop rolls and then just tell everyone like, hey, like when we're rolling, this is how we roll safely. This is what we should be doing, not doing. People need to tone it down to work on this, whatever we're working on. And then follow up with the person privately after the fact. So you're still managing the moment. You're sort of stopping what's happening, but you're not calling someone out personally in the moment. And then you're having the conversation you can plan for afterwards to make sure that whoever was the offender sort of gets the message clearly.
One other thing I'd want to ask you here while we're talking about boundaries and red lines, what's your strategy on communicating this stuff up front? And I ask this because something I've observed is that most gyms fail to do this. They will have an unspoken culture code, maybe things like you said, where we don't tolerate sexism on the mats, but they won't necessarily advertise that or put that up front. And I've heard other coaches say that they do this and they will have their full code of conduct on the wall. Maybe they will even read through the code of conduct to people visiting the gym for the first time. I mean, that can come across, I guess, as being overly administrative, but I can see the value because people do come from different walks of life. And something that you feel is not okay at the gym might be something that another person just had no idea was even a problem here. What are your thoughts on communicating this to people, and how do you make sure that expectations are set when it comes to boundaries and red lines at the gym?
Yeah, so establishing or defining a culture, I think, is very challenging. So I think it's important to communicate things up front about culture. In terms of like, what are your goals? What's everyone's role here? In my opinion, like a small amount of the work though, I think most of the work is how are people behaving and treating each other in the environment. And that means that you can't, you know, define something and hang it up or email it out and think that your culture is defined. It's how we're reacting, treating each other every day, day in and day out, is going to define the culture more than anything, more than, you know, rules, social media stuff. It's your presence in the building. It's your team's presence in the building. I always think about, especially like longtime members of the gym. To me, they're like culture enforcers. You know, they're the people that I know understand what we're looking for. I know they're behaving in that way, and they're going to be my eyes and ears to deal with these things, have conversations, or bring things to me so that I can have conversations. That's the most impactful thing at all. So a lot of that is understanding how your own behavior affects culture. If you're a coach or you're a gym owner or even a student, you know, how does what you're doing affecting behavior? And as an example, if you're in a situation where something needs to be addressed and you don't address it, then you are contributing to the deterioration of the culture of the gym. And so everyone has a responsibility to like uphold it. Now, if you're walking into a new environment, how do you define that for somebody? The upfront communication is good. I think that this is where, we can talk about red flags. Most people with a decent social IQ, emotional IQ are going to walk into an environment knowing it's a new environment and start to try to get the vibe of the culture, how people are talking to each other, how people are treating each other, and adapt to the environment that they walk into. And if someone walks in and they're not doing that, then to me, that's a red flag. I don't expect someone to know the culture on day 1, but I do on day 5. I do on day 6. And if people are walking in and not making observations, not trying to assess how people are operating to each other, then they're not just getting the culture. They're not even trying to, right? So like, to me, that's a red flag. So I'm going to start keeping an eye on this person to kind of see where they go with this. And I wish there was a cleaner, easier way to do that. But the most important thing is, how do we behave? How do we treat each other? How do we talk to each other? How do we address tough conversations? That's going to go further to defining and keeping a culture than anything else that you do.
Got it. Now, how do you make the decision that someone is irredeemable and it's time to end the relationship? And of course, from a coach's perspective, this can come up in a lot of different ways. It could be the students in your gym. It could be the coaches that you employ. Could even be business partners or vendors that you use. There comes a point where you've given people all of the chances that you're willing to give them and you have to end the relationship. I would love to get your perspective on, first of all, how you identify when that time has come. And second, how do you handle what could potentially be a very explosive and challenging conversation, right? No one likes to get broken up with. And is one thing if it is, just a casual relationship with a person that in the real world. It's another thing if it's a brown or a black belt coach who maybe already has a chip on their shoulder, and maybe that's why you need to break up with them here, but you don't always know how people are going to react. These can be very challenging situations in a martial arts environment. How do you know when it's time to do something like this? And then how do you go about that process?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to this. I'll start with the approaching angle of this first, and that sort of picks up where I left off in terms of, we need to plan for a conversation. We have to gather facts. We have to get perception. We have to sit down with someone, let them give them their side of the story. And that is like the beginning of the conversation is really important. That's why I suggest people sort of write out the first 2 sentences, define tone and topic. And then what happens in the middle of the conversation, obviously, is important too. Like, where's this conversation to go once you get someone's perspective and you start navigating something with somebody? And even if a conversation starts to go kind of sideways, in terms of someone's deflecting, someone's making excuses, you have to learn in tough conversation how to deal with all that, how to consistently, not take the bait, refocus everything back to like the focal point of what you're trying to address. Is someone taking that process or that conversation seriously, right? And sometimes you can assess that in one conversation and sometimes you can't. If I'm trying to get something across and they have zero intention of listening to me or like respecting the conversation, then we start to make decisions pretty early. Like, okay, if you're not going to respect to the expectations that I'm drawing as far as how we're going to operate in this environment, then I don't know why. I don't think you're a good fit here. Like, in order for you to operate in this environment, in order for you to train here, if in a different context, in order for you to work here, like, this is the rules of the road that I'm laying down for you, and you can accept them or not accept them. If you don't accept them, then you can't train here, you can't work here, we can't be in this relationship. Now, laying down that rules of the road, I think, is a process that looks differently depending on the situation, depending on the red line, for example. Anything that's egregious for me, my red lines, I honestly don't have much of a conversation. It's, you know what, like, this happened, you crossed the red line, this is unacceptable here, I'm going to have to ask you to go, you're not welcome back. And I don't really entertain much debate at that point. Like, if I know for sure that the red line has been crossed, it's like, you know what, the decision has been made. Like, this is just unacceptable here, and this isn't a debate. I'm just going to have to ask you to leave and please don't come back. And keep it that simple. And then they leave and you move on with life. And that is, in my opinion, actually easier, because even if someone does get mad in that context and they want to yell at me or whatever, like, I don't care, because I'm not engaging in it. At that point, it's no longer a conversation to me. The decision's been made, and we're not discussing whether or not this is going to happen. It's happening. The conversation and navigating whether or not we cut ties with somebody, we draw the red line, gets to be harder when someone hasn't really crossed the red line, but they're just doing something that you have to address. An example of something that might be challenging might be like employee performance, right? Let's say you own a gym and you have a coach, someone at the front desk. I used to run restaurants, so I have a manager, I have a server who is great people, maybe they worked with you for a long time, but all of a sudden they're not doing anything that warrants termination, it warrants any major conversation other than it just doesn't seem like they care anymore. Maybe they're just not performing. Their attitude shift has changed considerably and you're worried about it. When you draw the line, it has to happen within a series of multiple conversations. And as you have them, you have to set yourself up for the next one. So in those kind of scenarios, like for me, conversation one would just be trying to seek understanding about the person that I'm talking to and trying to reestablish an understanding about what we're going to do going forward. So the beginning of a conversation is really important as far as establishing tone and topic. In the middle of the conversation, you need to really get perspective. And the end of the conversation is obviously important because that's when you clarify that you're on the same page and sort of like what the next steps are. And to me, that creates a very strong like reference point. So you have that conversation and 3 weeks goes by and nothing has changed. And you have to have your second conversation. You have a reference point where it's like, hey, we sat down 3 weeks ago. We had this conversation. I thought we're on the same page. I don't really feel like anything's changed. Like, is there a reason why? Are we not actually on the same page? Is there something else that we need to address? And then you kind of put it on the person to say, I told you I agreed with you, but that was BS, or I'm just not feeling it, or I don't like training here anymore. Whatever the case is, like let the conversation materialize since it was the middle portion of it. But again, end the conversation to set yourself up for, in this case, a third conversation. At some point, you have to start communicating at the end points of conversations. Like, I'm trying to work with you here. I'm trying to like understand where you're coming from. I'm trying to establish common ground. But if we can't get to a place where we both feel comfortable with what's happening, then this isn't going to work for us. Like, whether that's you saying you can't train here, whether you're a student talking to a coach saying I'm going to go to another gym, whether it's an employee that you might have to fire or change roles, you have to slowly like let them know through the conversation. Now, when do you draw the line? Is it the third conversation, fourth conversation, fifth conversation? This is where I think that there's a little bit of art form to assessing somebody's, I like to use the word good faith. Like, are they really acting in good faith in their conversation with you and really making an effort to make the changes that you want to see in them? And if not, then to me, the red lines are pretty soon. If they are working hard and they are actually making a genuine effort, then I will let those conversations go on longer and just like try to keep building or sort of correcting and building somebody as they go. But if you get to the point where you're, let's say, 5 conversations in and nothing has changed and you have to draw that line, then you've done so much work at that point that you should feel comfortable drawing the line. You should feel comfortable telling somebody like, hey, I've tried multiple times to connect with you, work with you, give you time, seek out your opinion, but nothing is changing. And it's getting to the point where maybe what you're doing isn't that red line in itself, but it's getting to the point where I feel like you just don't take me seriously. And this is a problem. Either you don't understand me or you don't take me seriously, one of the two. And you have to decide which one is which, or we're going to have to start having a different kind of conversation, whether you can still be in this environment with me or not, whether it's a gym, whether it's at work, whatever the environment is. And then that's at that point, the conversation becomes pretty clear where things that maybe weren't clear red lines, like a performance issue, an attitude issue, becomes a clear line, and that you've addressed it enough times to where if it continues to happen, you should feel confident that you've treated this person with respect, you've given them chances, you've tried to work with them, you tried to build them up. And once it's time to draw the line and make it and go a different route, they sort of made that decision for themselves. I used to have a saying, like, in actuality, in my professional life, I probably fired a lot of people, but I would always say, like, I didn't actually fire anybody. Everyone just sort of fires themselves through their words and through their behavior. And I think if you're having conversations correctly, professionally, and you're going through the process, giving people the benefit of the doubt, trying to work with them, and they just won't play ball with you, at some point, to me, it turns into like a respect issue. Like, either you don't want to be here or you don't respect the conversation that we're having. There's no point in me continuing to engage in this. Either you're going to put forth the energy or we're just going to go our separate ways.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And, something that I observe, and I'm sure many people have observed, is that people often don't understand that a jiu-jitsu gym is a place of business, and they fail to act accordingly there. When you are on the clock at work, everyone knows that you're on the job, and if you've got half a brain, you will try to come in with a degree of professionalism. You'll understand that there's lines that you don't cross and things that you obviously don't do. But when it comes to jiu-jitsu gyms, a lot of the time, the people who hang out there or even the people who work there, they treat it more like a social club where they can kind of just fuck around and do what they want rather than understanding that this is actually a place of business. And for a lot of gym owners, I know this can be a tremendous frustration because they will have people who are just kind of acting like idiots because they don't realize that this is supposed to be a professional environment. Those people could be doing things that drive off your other customers or reduce the customer experience. And they'll say things like, well, why can't I? This is who I am. Why can't I just say things that I want to say? And at some point you have to explain to them, buddy, this is my livelihood. I am the gym owner here. When you come in here and you say dumb shit, that reflects on me and that takes away money from me. This is something that I've had to think about a lot too, as I worry about, building up community. Is there's a lot of people who come in and they don't understand. Like people pay the bills by providing services like what we do and like what you do. And when someone comes in and they don't properly respect that professional environment, it ultimately hurts the service provider. And if you as the gym owner allow that, then you're just going to probably keep churning customers. You're going to lose business opportunities, and the quality of the culture you're trying to create is going to be degraded over time.
Yeah, and to your point about the social club, I think that's where if you are a coach or a gym owner, you have to ask yourself, what is it that you're doing this for? Are you doing this because you want a social club? Because if that's the case, and there's going to be consequences to that as far as the type of things that are going to happen in your gym. Are you doing this because you want to run a business, a professional environment? If that's the case and you're treating it like a social club, then you're setting the tone as far as your own words and your own behavior of the culture. You're setting yourself up for failure in terms of the culture and in terms of the conversations that you're going to have when people start treating it like a social club when that's not what you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing I want to pick your brain on here, the delivery mechanism for these conversations. Is there a time when it's better to have a conversation in person, or is there a time when you should do it by, sending a text message or a private email or something like that? And I ask this because conventional wisdom always says you should have difficult conversations face to face, but that's not always true, especially in this environment. Safety can be a concern. I mean, if you are a 50-year-old, 150-pound black belt, and the person you're having that conversation with is a 250-pound, 20-year-old black belt who's known to fly off the handle about things, sometimes you do have to worry about this. And I ask this because I have seen discussions go down on sites like Reddit where people say, I've got this problem at my gym. I feel like I'm being sexually harassed by one of the coaches. What should I do? And someone will come in and say, well, you should talk to that person. If you're not comfortable doing that, talk to the coach directly. And they'll come back and say, look, I'm not even comfortable doing that, because I don't know how this person is going to respond if I accuse someone in the gym of sexual harassment. Is my safety at risk? And so sometimes I wonder, is there a place for conversations that are not handled face to face? And I'd love to get your thoughts on whether there's a time and a place to do things man to man, woman to woman in person versus a time to maybe send a text message or an email. When is one appropriate versus the other?
Yeah, I think obviously if there's a safety concern, then in person doesn't work. Or maybe if you do it in person, do it in like a public environment, like at a restaurant or something where there's people, I think that in person is necessary if you feel like, you're going to be in, I would refer to as sort of like a long form conversation, maybe someone you've known for a long time. You don't think this conversation is going to end anything, but it might be tough. You might have to have 2 or 3 of them. To me, having those conversations in person are important because you have to assess someone's position and read the person really, really well to kind of know where they're going to take it and how seriously they're taking the conversation. I also think it's easier to redirect conversations in person. When you go to have a tough conversation and someone starts being defensive or they're arguing or they're deflecting or whatever they're making excuses, I find it's easier in person just to like literally just kind of put your hand up and just say, whoa, hold on a second. Like, if those things are important too, we can talk about those, but not in this conversation. Like, this conversation is about what happened yesterday. Let's get through that. Let's get on the same page. And then if those other things are bothering you, we'll talk about that after. To me, it's easier to do that in person. I do think that people you can say it's more respectful or honorable to have a conversation in person, but at the same time, I think that it's, if you've made a decision about something and it's obvious that there isn't going to be a lot of things that you have to navigate, then just make a phone call and be done with it, right? Like, one thing about conversations, and to your point about when do you call it, like when do you draw the red line, you have to protect your team. That's a big part of what you're doing in terms of culture, but you also have to protect yourself. Like, if you're dealing with something and it's getting to the point where, it's ruining your own experience, whether you're a student or a coach or whoever, and you're just trying to do what's right. You're trying to deal with stuff, but it's getting to the point where it's just like weighing you down. It's taking your time. It's taking your emotional and your mental energy. At some point, that alone to me is sort of an offense. And if I'm at that point, I'm just going to make a phone call and end something, because I've already made the decision that I'm not going to invest any more emotional energy into something that I've already dumped a lot of emotional energy into. There's no point, So of course, it would be honorable to have a conversation in person, but I don't think that there's a huge problem with just getting on the phone. I would call someone versus text them though. I don't think there's a difference between being passive aggressive and just choosing to do something remote, so to speak, if that makes sense. So I would at least do a phone call versus a text.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I mean, my suggestion to most people is whenever you're going to send something digitally, whether it be a post on the internet or a post on social media or a text message or an email, think really long and hard before you send it. I mean, I have seen so many problems come up because of a message that was sent off without a lot of thought. People tend to be overly hostile and rude in digital written form, and even if your intent was not to be rude, it is often perceived that way by the other person. It's very hard to communicate nuance through digital text. So my suggestion is always, you can avoid a lot of problems in life by just not posting that or sending that message. And that's always something to think about. Now, that said, though, it's also important to point out that there are times when you may actually need to create a paper trail. And that's kind of a different situation, especially if there is criminal evidence of something happening, or if you need to make sure that what's happened is documented. There may be times where you have to create a paper trail, but generally speaking, the risk of communicating through text is that usually that is the worst way to connect with someone, and conversations like that have a tendency to go off the rails. So that is just something to bear in mind if you choose to communicate that way. I mean, if safety is not an issue, yeah, you're probably best off trying to communicate with words if you possibly can. I mean, obviously no one wants to get subjected to verbal abuse, but like you said, worst case scenario, doing a phone call, that's still an option as well.
Yeah. And the thing about writing is that when you're writing, you're not listening. So I actually really like to write because it's just easier for me to sort of visually formulate my thoughts than just trying to just think in the moment. So if there's something very important that I need to get through, I might write it first, but then deliver it in person, not like read it, but just work through the mental process of building my thoughts through the writing, but then have the conversation in person. If you're writing something, let's say you're going to email off something to somebody and you're 6 paragraphs deep in something, if you had that conversation in person, after paragraph 2, the person that you're communicating with may have said something to you that was like enlightening, that would have changed your perception. And so by going that far and just dumping everything out, you're sort of not giving that person the opportunity to respond and kind of get on the same page with you about what you're talking about, which naturally is going to make someone defensive. Like, why is this person just dumping all this stuff on me? I don't even feel like it's accurate. That's not even what happened. That wasn't my intention. So at least phone call or, in-person conversation allows for that back and forth. So you don't make the mistake of just making assumptions and dumping them on people.
Well, we talked about how this is a skill set that can be cultivated. Ben, tell me, if someone wanted to get better at having difficult conversations, if they wanted to learn how to overcome the fears of having these conversations, and if they want to learn how to plan for and execute these conversations more effectively, what do you suggest they do? Are there any practices that you would suggest, or are there books or resources to consume, or maybe courses to take? I would love your thoughts on how people could intentionally cultivate the skill if it's something that they're looking to develop.
Yeah, the most important thing I would say is practice. And it's difficult if you're not in, this is an issue that's always been important to me because I became a manager of restaurants when I was 21 years old. I was young. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea to have hard conversations. I'm not a naturally assertive person. I'm naturally don't like conflict. And so I was lucky to be surrounded by managers at the time who gave me that feedback and coached me through a process, and I forced myself to do it. So every single tough conversation that had to happen in the restaurant, I said, I want to have that conversation. And I want you to sit next to me so you can give me feedback after the fact. Now, if you're not in the environment that, like a restaurant with 60, 70 employees where you're having to have these conversations, then it's more difficult to just take it as it comes. So I think that you have to, don't avoid them, right? Every opportunity to address something is an opportunity to practice. I think there's things that you can do on your own to practice, even if it's just thinking about what you would say in a situation. So if you were in a situation and you're a student and you're rolling and someone does something that you don't feel comfortable with, like right now, as you're listening to this, if you don't know what you would say, just at the end of the podcast, sit down and write that out. That way you have it ready. And it's, thinking about it in the moment, you kind of have something established, ready to go. And think about it through the context. Like, I just need to address this, manage the moment, address the situation. The words, I think people get caught up in like, what do I say as far as the exact words? And the simpler and the more objective that they are, the better. Just very, very clear. Not making it about the thing that's happening and not necessarily the person. Like, if you just said, I don't like rolling with you, that doesn't give that person anything, and it's probably not going to be very productive. Whereas if you just said, hey, like, you're being too heavy when you're rolling, or maybe you're moving too fast and you're submitting, you're pulling too hard, you need to slow down. Like, that's much, much more specific. And you can think about the words that you would use even before it happens. That way, when it happens, you're ready and you're not caught off guard. The more challenging thing to practice is when you're dealing with difficult topics that will take multiple conversations. And obviously you just have to do it. As far as how to practice it, I remember being a young manager and people would, I would like go to workshops where we would talk about this stuff and we would role play tough conversations, and I'd be given like conversation models. And I honestly I'm not a fan of those. So like the sandwich model, like gives positive, negative, positive, there's different like models. I don't think those models are very good, especially when you're dealing with relationships that already feel unnatural to you. And then you're trying to stuff your words into a model that's sort of unnatural as well, as far as a natural dialogue between two people. So practice as much as you can when the opportunity comes up. If you know that you have to have a tough conversation, like ask for help. So let's say I need to go talk to a student and I'm not sure how to address it. And I come to you, Steve, and I'm like, hey, I gotta have this conversation. This is what happens. Can I like talk to you as if you're that person? And then just, role play with me, throw me off guard, see what I have to say. And usually the most challenging part is just getting through the beginning and establishing like the tone and the topic. Because if you mess that up, trying to recover in the middle or the end is much, much more challenging. So that'd be my advice. Think ahead of time, like strategize ahead of time. Think about your relationships, trust that you can have a conversation and it doesn't have to turn into conflict. In fact, the tough conversations often lead, when they're done well, often lead to better relationships and better cultures. There's a level of sort of assertiveness and trust in the process. Just force yourself to do it.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Ben. Man, if people listen to this and they think, this guy sounds like he's got a gym I want to train at, tell us a little bit about Deep Blue. Where is it? What's the culture look like? What do you do there? And how can people find you and train with you?
Yeah, so I'm the co-owner. I'm the head coach. I also have a coach's team that helps run classes with me. My gym is located, it's in Grand Rapids, just outside of Grand Rapids. It's a town called Caledonia. And the best place to get a hold of me would be on probably social media. I don't have personal social media. My gym social media is just at Deep Blue Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'd be more than happy to, talk to people, answer questions, help people through tough conversations. Please reach out. If you're in the area, stop by. We'd love to have you. In terms of my gym, culture-wise, like I said, I'm very proud of the culture that I would say we created. It hasn't just been me, it's been a group effort. And that has been a group effort, but also a deliberate effort. And meaning I put people in place as in like a coach's role, or even move people up the ladder of promotion when I know that they understand the culture and they understand the mission that we have. And I won't do that if they don't. And that's a key point in, I think, defending the culture of a gym. And that's certainly something that we have at Deep Blue and I'm very proud of.
Awesome, man. Well, I will put links to the gym and to your social in the show notes. So if people are in the Grand Rapids area, they want to drop by and visit or train with you, it'll make it easy for them to do that. So just pop open your podcast player, go to show notes, info, description, whatever. You should find an easy link that you can tap to get there. I'll also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. Almost 300 episodes of the podcast. All of it should be as educational today as it was when it was first recorded. You can also sign up for our newsletter. Over 10,000 people on that list. I definitely recommend getting on there because there's a ton of great free resources and sometimes some great freebies that we throw in there as well that you're probably going to want. Beyond that, if you want to kick it up with us, you can join BJJ Mental Models Premium. You'll get access to what I believe is the world's biggest library of Jiu-Jitsu courses on strategy, tactics, mindset, kind of a level above the more technique-oriented stuff you get when you go with a lot of video instructionals. That's why I love audio as a medium. You are kind of forced to talk at a higher level. You'll also get access to amazing ongoing professional premium podcasts that we do. Emily Kwok's, Joe Hannon's, and Drew Foster's podcasts are on there. It's the only way to get them. And we've got some more premium ones coming soon too that I'm not quite ready to announce yet. kick it up to the next level, we've also got a coaching tier where you can get direct coaching from quite literally some of the best black belts in the world. If you've ever wanted to have a closer look at how you roll, the kind of level of detail that you're unlikely to get at the gym when your coaches has their attention divided in 30 different ways, this is probably the most cost-effective way to do that. And of course, you'll also get a ticket to our private community. You can come and yell at Ben and myself in there. And Ben, again, of course, I can't thank you enough for the support over the years, man. It's been awesome having you as a premium member, and it's been great to have you here and have a chance to share your ideas out there. I love the way that you talk about culture. I was thinking the other day, I saw someone post a message and they said that the most important things in the gym really are safety and fun. The actual technique is maybe number 3 on the list. And that really resonated with me because we are in a sport where right now everyone is hyper focused on the quality of the techniques and the coaching methods, and all of that does matter. But if it's not a safe and it's not a fun environment, people aren't going to hang around. Doesn't matter how good the technique is. So I think it's awesome that you're prioritizing this stuff. And man, I hope people got as much out of listening to you speak here on this as I did. It was a great conversation. So thanks for coming by.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. It's my pleasure.
Most welcome, my friends. And thank you to the listeners too. We'll talk to you next week. See you soon.